This is a Channel Africa podcast. You can also get Channel Africa on satellite, PAS10, DSTV Audio Bouquet 802, and OpenView Bouquet, Channel 628.
The situation in Sudan is under the spotlight at the Pan-African Parliament in Midrand in the Gauteng province of South Africa. The second ordinary session of the Sixth Parliament is underway. And to discuss this further, we have on the line Senator Abdi Ismail Samatar from the Somali Parliament. Senator, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us on Africa Update.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Now, what has come up for discussion so far with regards to the situation in Sudan?
I think the urgency of getting some degree of security at the capital has been at the core of some of the discussions we had this morning, because if the capital collapses and becomes what Mogadishu, Somalia was like 30 years ago, then the discussion was that we should preempt the 30-year war by controlling and surrounding and supporting the population of Khartoum. That was the core of the issue.
And, just focusing on the issue of conflict on the continent as well, Pan-Africanist scholar Professor Patrick Lumumba spoke of how quickly and things have to be resolved with urgency. And speaking of how the movement, or when it comes to dealing with such crisis, African leaders don't seem to really have the drive to get things back to normalcy for a lot of countries. Is this the case, and has this come up? And how are you planning on dealing with it as parliamentarians?
No, I think Professor Lumumba has a point, and the continental leadership has been lacking and absent in many of these crises, partly because we have become isolated islands as countries rather than working as a unit, as an African Union. So the name is great, but the substance that name contains is vacuous. And so he has a point there. But I really think, the Ethiopian Prime Minister, for instance, and the Southern Sudanese President have been deeply engaged, because they are the two countries who are some of the most affected places because of the spillover from that war. So I think if the African Union can give a very solid mandate to the Sudanese, South Sudanese, and the Ethiopian presidents and prime ministers, that will be the first act. The second act, I don't think as an African Union we should complain about the Saudis and the Americans getting into the act, because we have been absent in action. And therefore, if they can bring peace to the Sudan, glorious. But the Sudanese people should have a voice. And the final point that has been raised is that the general who was, quote-unquote, the president of the country was illegitimate, and the general who is challenging him is also illegitimate, and particularly has a very horrible record in Darfur and elsewhere. And so the former prime minister who was forced out, who's a civilian, who has been supported by the civic movement in Sudan, that's the person who should be brought back, and these two people should be moved to the sides to move the peace process and the democratization process in the Sudan forward.
Do you think some of these recommendations that you've touched on will appease both generals? Because it's all about it's a power struggle, and without even thinking about the repercussions of what it does to the citizens of a country and the economy of Sudan.
This is exactly what happened to Somalia 32 years ago. It was about individual power posturing that destroyed the country and put it in hell for 30 years. So my sense is that if the international community rallies around the agenda of bringing that man back for a year so that elections can be held, and that these two generals can be told, the game is over, but that you will be treated honorably, and so on and so forth. That is the way the Ethiopian Prime Minister and the Sudanese president, South Sudanese president, that's what they should be pushing. And by bringing an independent person from outside might have the chance of diffusing. And if they refuse to do so, then much as I hate The Hague as an African academic and politician, I think that's what they should be looking at.
And do you think that the previous leader of Sudan will want to return? Because It may be an issue of also his own safety, because clearly there have been some threats for him to even, with the coup and everything that took place, there have been some threats towards him.
I think if the African Union speaks on that as a force and then mobilizes the international community, I think it has a good chance. And the former Prime Minister, I think, is convincible to be able to take the lead, to lead his country and Africa into a peace. And
Senator, speaking of the African Union, why do you think it has become, there is no, whether it's passion, whether it's the right word that I'm using, or whether there's no drive for the African Union to push for peace on the African continent, apart from Sudan? I'm just going to deviate very quickly and speak of countries like the DRC. We have countries that are also in conflict, and there are a lot of issues and a lot of players in that conflict. Why is it so difficult for the African Union to take action and take action quickly?
Well, the African Union, just like the United Nations, to some degree, consists of members, and these members, most of them are sort of undemocratic, to be blunt. They have particularistic interest rather than the collective African people's interest. And so that's what becomes an issue that blockades the collective will to take this bull by the horn and move forward. So, for instance, if you look at the DRC, remember the years when Uganda was interested, when Rwanda was interested, when Angola was interested, when Zimbabwe was interested, and it was all about this interest, rather than saying there is going to be the Democratic Republic of Congo must be governed by its people. And secondly, the government in all of these places, by and large, there are exceptions, but in many of these places is highly undemocratic. So by being undemocratic, you cannot advocate democracy for others. And so when you mix a sort of a collective personal interest, leadership personal interest from these countries, and then the undemocratic nature of the regimes in many parts of Africa, then you have a recipe where the African Union is basically defanged and has no teeth to bite these kind of issues.
And with the celebration of the 60th anniversary of the OAU, the predecessor of the African Union, and celebrating Africa Day yesterday, going forward, are we going to see a different African Union, in the sense that putting deadlines and working on timeframes and dealing with crisis more actionable? Because it just, as you say, it's just a movement with an organization with no teeth to bite.
Well, for instance, one of the first things the African Union can do if the countries are committed is to say every country makes a contribution of $10 million. That is $550 million, $500 million. That will give the resources, some of the resources the organization needs to address some of the issues that are burning in the continent. But as long as the money for the African Union security and everything else is coming from outside, we have become imbeciles and the laughing stock of the international community. And everybody knows that the African Union, you cannot take them seriously because they don't use their own resources. And so unless we make those collective contributions to the union and then make it effectively use that resource in places where there are crises, then we will be revisiting this again and again, maybe in another 60 years. Unfortunately.
Senator, for interest's sake, what sort of response have you received if you have tabled this particular, recommendation to the Pan-African parliamentarians with regards to maybe going back and looking at, the contribution of $10 million from each and every country on the continent?
$10 million, for instance, for South Africa is peanuts. $10 million for Nigeria is peanuts, for Algeria, for Egypt. I can go down the list.
Yes.
But what we need is the kind of moral force and commitment to see this. And so the African Union, the African Parliament here is a sort of advisory body. It doesn't have any teeth itself. And so the African Union has to first empower the parliament so that actually it becomes the legislative organ, the legitimate legislative organ of the continent. Then and only then can what we decide here have teeth to ensure that the leaders in the union go and proceed and effectively do what we instructed them to do. But as long as it's a sort of a legislative that doesn't have any legislative power, and it's what we recommend is subject to the whims of the folks in Addis Ababa, then whatever recommendations we make here becomes sort of taken away by the wind.
And just some of the ideas that you're speaking of, these are doable, and if every member would commit and get concrete commitment from their countries, it would make a huge difference on the African continent to avoid, as you said, us becoming a laughingstock.
Oh, absolutely. I am convinced. This is my first time in Parliament. I'm a first time elected in Somalia, and this is my first visit here. And as an African who has been engaged in this as an academic, I can see incredible potential of the union and this continent. And there are certain ways. We are talking about free trade in Africa. I think that's BS, in my opinion. I think what we need to do, for instance, as I said to my colleagues in the hall, I said South African construction industry is quite productive one. We don't bring the Chinese here, we don't bring the Japanese, we don't bring anybody here. We build our bridges, we build our highways, and so on and so forth. And so just imagine if the African continent comes together to the government of South Africa and says, listen, you have a precious thing here. We want to support it so that it can not only develop here in this country, but also support the rest of the continent rather than bringing in the Chinese and whatnot. So let's invest in the construction industry in South Africa as a continental asset. These are the kind of things that we don't need anybody's ideas or anybody's money. We can do it ourselves. But as long as this legislative body that I'm sitting in is advisory, it becomes a talking shop. And we won't be able to make the kind of advances that are necessary in this continent and in our separate countries.
And what is the reaction from after you made that address and after you made those statements? What is the reaction from your member parliamentarians?
Goodwill, but there has been no resolution. Not yet, at least.
That podcast was courtesy of Channel Africa, the African Perspective.